Hey there, this is AK Blake with the Summit Realty Group out of Fairbanks, Alaska here. And today I wanted to talk to you about how you could use your primary residence as an investment home. So I have a lot of clients that want to get started investing that either only own the home they live in or they don't even own their first home yet. So I kind of sat down thinking, hey, I want to write an article on your first investment home. And kind of what it morphed into was like, hey, for a lot of people in a lot of scenarios, your first investment home, probably the best option is where you live. And a few benefits of doing it that way is the lending. So if you are buying a house just for an investment and you're needing a loan, you're not buying it cash, the down payments necessary, usually about 20% or better for an investment. Whereas if you're buying something to live there as a primary residence, a lot of times you can get down to 3%, 3.5%, VA is zero down. USDARD, which is a rural development loan if you live in a rural area and can make that work for you, is also zero down. You're just paying like closing costs and such. So that's one of the big benefits. And another one we're going to talk about in more detail is you have to live somewhere. So it's going to cost you to live somewhere. So if you are combining where you're living with an investment, you can maybe knock out two birds with one stone, basically. So first, I want to kind of define assets and liability because this is going to relate pretty heavily to what we go into next. A liability, in short, is something that costs you money. An asset is something that makes you money. Your house where you live is going to be a liability. So you may be thinking, well, why should I use my primary residence where I live as an investment if I already know it's going to be a liability? Why don't I rent and buy an investment home? And we kind of already spoke about some of the benefits there. And the thing is renting also is a liability. It costs you money. So you have to live somewhere. You either have to rent or you have to buy. And the first thing I want to cover is which of those you should do. And this is super personal. So if you are living with your parents and paying nothing and not paying utilities or anything like that, then it's probably going to be really stinking hard for owning a house to be any cheaper than that because it's at zero. But if you're renting like most people do and paying, it's really going to depend on your market. But what we want to go through right now is the numbers. And I want to let you know I do have an article that breaks all these numbers down into tables. I'm going to be looking down at that article to refer to it because it's a bunch of numbers. If you want to go back or even as we go kind of look at the tables and decide for yourself how you want to go about it. What's going to be super important for you to remember throughout this whole video is that these numbers are for my specific market and for a very specific house that we're using as a subject property. So you can't just use these numbers to make a decision. You need to look at how we did the calculation and again, which we're going to go over and decide for yourself what's going to be better. So if you look at renting, so again, I told you I'd pull a subject property. So this is a real property that sold just a few months ago in our market here in Fairbanks. I just want to go over the details there so we're all on the same page. The purchase price, or it sold for $300,000. It was legitimately rented right before it sold for $1,950. I don't know if that continued afterwards or whatever, but when it sold, it was $1,950. It's a 3-bed, 2.5 bath, 1,504 square foot, built in 2007. It was in excellent condition, sat on 0.2 acres in city here. So if you were to rent that, your deposit, I put at $2,000 to match the rent. And as you may have remembered, the rent just said it was $1,950. I did up that to $2,000. Rent rates have gone up a lot, and everything I saw made it look like $2,000 would be a fair price for this. And that would be with the tenant paying for their fuel and water and sewer and electric, all utilities to be paid by the tenant. So if we look at, so again, your rent for the first year is going to be $2,000. Electric, we put at $145, water and sewer at $90, and your fuel is going to be $200 a month. For the first year at least, your monthly expenses would total up to $2,435. And if you combine that all together for a full year, that's $29,220. Now there's a few things that I want to talk about is when you are renting or buying, you have to choose how long you're going to be doing these things to kind of make a decision. So if you're going to rent for 1 year, or if you're going to buy for 1 year, it may probably going to be a better idea to rent, to be honest. But if you plan to live somewhere for 2 years or more, buying usually kind of wins out over the renting. So buying is kind of a long-term benefit, whereas renting can be better in the short term because there's not nearly as many upfront costs. So year one, like I said, came just under $30,000, but we're going to set this term for 5 years because I'm going to assume that you're going to be living in this market and try to buy and hold houses as long as you can. Even if you do move out of them later, maybe you won't sell them, you'll just hold on to them and rent out which you can, or make income on it in some way, basically. So, but if you look forward, year 2, 3, 4, 5, when you're renting, there's a few changes that we need to make. First, the rent itself. The national average is about 3 to 5% increase in rent year over year. Here, where we're at, rent is it's not really expensive. I mean, it's pretty expensive compared to a lot of places, but it's very, very strong in the fact that there is just not enough rentals out there for as many tenants. So demand is really high, and prices have been going up further than 5% a year, but I just maxed it out in that range of we're going to increase this rent 5% each year because your lease would be up, and this ostensibly could happen to you where your rent would go up that amount. Now your electric, your water, your sewer, and your fuel, that's hard to guess because recently our energy costs have gone up a ton, fuel in particular. And fuel, just so you know, this may not be a big concern for everybody. Most of the homes here in Alaska are heated through the diesel fuel. So that is a big concern for us here. It's usually the #1 utility cost. Electric is coming in second, just depending on how your house is set up. So I've increased those by the 10-year average of inflation, which is 1.8%. which to me seemed really low, especially looking back these few years when the inflation rate is definitely rising big time. So it's hard to say what it's going to be and where it's going to go, but just went off, again, that 10-year average of this is how things have been rising up. And again, maybe the past 10 years have been low inflation amounts for the US, but we're going to do the best we can, and all these calculations we're going to use that same number. So at least it should even it out for each case. We're not going to use a different inflation number for these expenses to make the numbers look better or anything like that. So after 5 years, with all those numbers going up, again, the table breaks down in that article, it breaks down each year. So if you want to look through and see, if you add all 5 years up and the one-time expense, which is your deposit, it comes out to $161,000 and some change. So now if you look at buying that same house, again, was $300,000, you have a few more upfront costs. It's a lot more expensive to buy than that $2,000 deposit. So depending on your loan type is really going to dictate your down payment. A conventional loan seems to be what most first-time home buyers are going with these days. So I'm going to use that just as an example. A lot of people think a conventional loan is 20% down, and that can be the case, but if you're using it as your primary residence, many times you'll get it as low as 5% down. And if it's your first time buying a house, at least here in Alaska, they can get that down to 3%. And I know a lot of other areas that can get that down to 3% as well. So you, again, would have to talk to a lender. So we're going to run the numbers off a 3% down payment, which would, of $300,000, of course, is $9,000. The next is your closing costs, which we put at $8,000. And this is a huge variable that can change just depending on a lot of things. First, your lender, what your lender charges you to get the loan, that can change big time, just lender to lender in the same town, and it changes more when you go to other areas. So, talking to a lender if you're deciding to buy, is going to be a good idea. The next is, of course, going to be the market and what's usually expected of a buyer to pay. And then the last is going to be what is written in your real estate contract. So in our contract, we have a table of closing costs, and you can really split it a million different ways. You can put percentages, 50-50. You could even do 75-20, which I don't think I've ever really seen. 100 for the seller and 0 for the buyer, and vice versa. So it's very negotiable. And again, so you just have to add it up. So I just kind of put an average of $8,000 for a $300,000 house here to buy. Now your mortgage, put it at $1,994.28, and that's going to cover 5 things. It's going to cover your principal, your interest, your private mortgage insurance, which you have to pay that on conventional FHA loans, and probably more besides that when you have less than 20% equity on it. Now for a conventional loan, once you have paid the principal down to where you have more than 20% equity of the house, which would be $60,000 for a $300,000 house, that private mortgage insurance will drop off, and but on FHA it stays there forever unless you refinance out into a different loan or something. But for the term of that loan, that mortgage insurance won't go away on an FHA loan, so that's something to consider. It also includes your taxes, which we have pretty expensive property taxes here. We don't have sales tax, and we don't have income tax, state income tax, I should say. So my guess is that they try to make it all up in property taxes. And then the last is going to be your insurance. Your lender generally requires that you roll your insurance into the payments. It's pretty nice. I've had one guy who didn't want to do that, and I don't really know, because you find the insurance and send it over to him. So the cost is going to be the same whether it's rolled in or not. But I don't know whatever happened to that guy. So the next is going to be your electric, water, sewer, fuel, which is all the same as the rental, as if you're living there, you just owned it. The one thing we have to add is maintenance costs, because when you're renting it, you just call the landlord. But now you are the landlord and the tenant all wrapped into one, since you're living there. So if you have something go wrong, you do have to fix it. Again, this is a huge number that can change vastly depending on the house, depending on the area, the cost of materials, anything like that. So what I've heard is a good rule of thumb is 1% of the purchase price for the annual cost, which for $300,000 would of course be $3,000. Divide that out, it'd be $250 a month, which for this one, it was a really good condition. I think that's very fair, maybe a little high, but it's about as close as we're gonna get. So again, if you need to adjust these numbers for yourself, do so. So that puts your total monthly expenses to buy it at $2,679.28, which is like $500 more than renting it. No, I'm sorry, about $200 more. And then it puts your yearly total expense at $32,151.36. So altogether, we add up the down payment, closing costs, which those are just one-time costs, and then all 5 years of just living there costs, you get $179,272.04. Which I haven't really talked about with a rental or this, but it kind of feels insanely high when you add it all together. And I know when I saw these numbers, I was like, oh shoot, how much am I spending? And I had my wife proofread this article, proofread this article to just kind of make sure I didn't say something like proofread. And she was really shocked at that as well. Like, we have to run our own numbers and see what we're doing, and I hope maybe you're feeling that same way. So anyways, if you compare it to the rentals, $179,000 and some change compared to $161,000 to rent it, you may think, hey, I should rent it. But that is not the end of the story. And again, maybe you should rent it, but let's get all the variables in place. And the next thing we got to talk about when you own a house is the 4 ways that you make money from owning a house, which the rental, if you rent something, you don't get any of those. So the first is your appreciation. A house will either appreciate or depreciate. Long-term houses have always gone up in value as long as you keep their condition good. I mean, if you run your house into the ground and it's just a piece of junk, it's not going to be worth more than when you bought it because you've ran into the ground. So if you keep that condition good going forward, generally, on average, your house is going to appreciate about 3.5% each year, which is the U.S. average. So I went ahead, when we do these calculations, that's over 5 years, we've done 3.5% annually for the house, just so you know. The next way you make money is the amortization of your loan. So paying down your loan, I said you're paying all 5 of these things. 4 of them just kind of go up in smoke, but the one that doesn't is when you pay your principal down. And it's a really sad percentage of the whole payment that goes to principal, especially at the beginning, because a lot of it's going to interest. But still, some of it every month is going to your principal, which is giving you more equity in the home. It's kind of hard to reach that equity. You usually have to sell the house or refinance or something to get it, but it's still your money, so you're not losing that all. So we've counted that as total as an expense, but we need to add back that amortization, which we'll do. The third benefit is your tax benefits. And this is super personal. It depends on your tax bracket, what you've done with your life, basically. So I've got this as a note, basically, of like, hey, this could be a benefit for you, but it's going to depend on your situation. Talk to a tax professional and see how it's going to implicate you, whether for the positive or the negative. Generally, it's a positive, unless you're making a bunch of capital gains. Then you can pay for that. So, and then the last, which is the most obvious, is cash flow, and that's what most people think of when they think investing. They're thinking renting it out and getting cash flow from the renter every month. So, don't need to go into that any further. This first one we've done none of the cash flow or anything like that. So the only money makers we're going to add back in is going to be that appreciation and the amortization of the loan, which I've already kind of spoke about. So if you took $300,000 over 5 years, 3.5% increase or appreciation every year, you're looking at about $356,305.89. So that gives you $56,000 and some change as an appreciation, which is really great. I mean, it's over 5 years. It's almost $10,000 or more than $10,000 a year. And your amortization, I went ahead and added back the $9,000 you put for a down payment, because again, that just goes straight to your equity. The closing costs are gone, but at least your down payment went to your equity. And then plus all the money that you paid down over the 5 years adds up to $38,996.69, which sounds really great at this point. But if you were to sell this house, which is what you have to do to see that amortization and to see that appreciation in your pocket, or refinance. So we'll assume that we've sold, and we'll assume for the renting side too, so we have a good comparison that you've moved out. To sell the house, back to the original point, is you've got some closing costs again. Whereas on a rental, you'll probably get $2,000 back for your deposit. Hopefully you're a really good renter and they gave that back to you. But when you go to sell, you are going to have to pay a real estate agent commission, which I just put for $356,000 sale. I put it a little over $21,000, and closing costs at about $5,000 above that. So at the end of a rental, again, you get back that $2,000, but everything else is still your expense. You've paid $159,000 and some change over 5 years. If you bought that same house, again, in this particular situation, you would have only paid $110,000 because we added back that appreciation and amortization went back into your pocket. So it's like a $50,000, just shy of $50,000 difference that you've saved. And yes, it still costs you money, but what we have to remember here is you have to live somewhere anyways. So if the only two choices you had, which there's usually more than two, but if you only had two choices to rent or to buy this house, and you're gonna live there for 5 years, I would say, looking at these numbers, it's probably a better idea to buy. But anything can change. You know, those appreciations can not go up as fast in 5 years. It can stagnate. So it's always a risk at the end of the day. And again, it's gonna depend on where you live and the rental situation that you're looking at. So run the numbers for yourself and decide if renting is gonna be better for you than the rest of these tactics we're talking about. They'll apply in some ways, but I'm really focusing on you living in this investment, not renting and you buying a different investment home. So it may not be as useful for you. But so let's say you decided to buy, and it's going to be cheaper for you to buy, save you a lot of good money. How can we take that $110,000 and reduce it down to zero, or even take it into the positive for you? Reduce it as much as possible. So the first tactic, which is kind of a low-hanging fruit for me to write about, is just buying something under market value or buying it cheap. If you buy something cheap, you have instant equity. And this is pretty obvious, but there's not a lot of sellers that are wanting to sell their house for less than it's worth. So what I call this is the friends and family discount, because really it's somebody giving you a good deal, and giving you a house that, let's say, is worth $300,000, but they give it to you for $270,000. It sounds like that never happens, but it absolutely does happen. So the only ways you can really be available for it is, for one, letting the people know around you that you're looking to buy a house, and maybe somebody wants to make you a good deal. You don't want to be that grubber who's trying to, steal something out from under somebody. But if somebody's giving and wants to do that for you, appreciate the gift and take it, I say. Or it's just some of your relationships have grown to where you can make yourself a good deal. So just let people know that, hey, you're looking, and just be open and listening. Maybe you've got an uncle or somebody who has a rental that they just really hate managing, and they want to get rid of it, and you're like, hey, I'll take that off your hands, and maybe they, again, want to help you out. So it could be a really good deal for you. I've done this once, and it was happenstance, but I would say that I was able to buy something cheap in a way. It did take me a little bit more work because it was a new construction. Had builders that I used to sell their houses for that built me a house cheap because they didn't have to pay their investors for money. I brought the money using a loan. It was not cash. And they didn't have to pay a real estate agent because I was a real estate agent to sell the house. So it saved them some money, so I was able to get the thing cheaper. I was able to buy the land from another real estate friend of mine, which wasn't really cheap. I would say it was pretty close to market value, but it was a good spot that he gave me first choice on, so that was kind of nice. So I ended up paying $160,000 for a new construction. This was down in Arkansas, not Alaska. You can't do that up here. I was going to live there a long time, but as things go, I only lived there for about 4 or 5 months, and we had to sell. So when we sold it for about $210,000, or just shy of that. So that was about a $50,000 equity gap, which was wonderful. And I did have to pay closing costs and things, so that was not my net, but still, it was pretty great. So I'm not saying that just to rub that in your face, but I do kind of want to run the numbers. If you do come across a deal like this, what it would look like as far as reducing your liability, because it's obviously if you buy something cheaper, the mortgage payment goes down, your appreciation, you have the instant equity, so your appreciation numbers would inflate up by that same amount. So I want to run the numbers again on this, we'll say this $300,000 house, and this is something that actually happened to my brother. I don't want to go over the real numbers, I don't even really know him, to be honest, but so these are not the numbers that he used, but when he bought my parents' house and they gave him a gift of equity when it happened. So we're going to pretend that same situation is available to you, like something like that comes up, and the same $300,000 subject house we've been talking about, old Billy Bob wants to sell it to you for $270,000, so you bought it cheap. So your down payment goes down, all your expenses go down, and I just want to hit the high points. Again, look at these charts in the article if you want to see all the detail and such. So your total monthly expenses for year one are at $2,528.39. And then of course everything goes up just like we talked about before, as far as the inflation rates and such. All the same will apply to this as well, and all the next ones going forward. That also puts your yearly total expenses for the year one at $30,000 and some change. So if you add together all 5 years and you add together the first one-time expenses you paid, it's only $169,000, whereas opposed to if you were buying it, it was $179,000. You save 10 grand just in your expenses, and that's really from the down payment mostly, and then your monthly payment was a lot lower. So as we go down and add the money makers back in to see, like, hey, again, after 5 years, we decided to sell this bad boy. The appreciation, instead of being $56,000 and some change, was now $86,000 because you had $30,000 that was, you appreciated, it didn't really appreciate, but that's where I added that in, that you had that instant equity of $30,000 because old Billy Bob gave it to you cheap. And then for your amortization, you actually had less. And this is because your payments were lower, your principal is lower, so your payments were lower and stuff, but you're also paying less principal each month. So you only paid $35,000 off as opposed to the $38,000 you did if you just bought it traditionally. And then your real estate agent commission and closing costs I kept the same because we're assuming that you sold it at the same price 5 years later because it was the same house. So instead of $110,000 that you spent to buy it or $159,000 that you spent to rent it, it would only be $74,000 if you were able to get a cheap deal. So that was kind of a freebie for me to give to you. It was probably not that helpful. If you run into a deal like that, you're kind of stupid maybe not to take it unless you're just unable to take the deal. But just kind of be open for those deals, I guess. It's not really a super helpful thing for me to say. If you're getting a good deal, a lot of times you'll know it. So just go for it. It'll obviously reduce your liability. Now, some of you may be thinking, hey, to get something cheap, you could just buy something that's distressed or in need of repairs or renovation. And yes, that's true, but I'm not considering that the same category. Because if you're buying something cheap, you're just getting something that was worth, let's again say $300,000, but you're getting it for less. It's still worth that $300,000. Whereas if you're buying something that is distressed or needing repairs, it's worth less. And the market decides this for you. So the market says, hey, in a perfect condition, this house is worth $300,000, but with all the repairs it needs, this thing, we're going to say it's worth $240,000 because buyers don't want to mess with it. The loans are a little bit more difficult. It's just a headache. So it drives that value down. So you're still getting it at market value, but when you add back in your work, then you're getting some what we call sweat equity from it. So this brings us to our next tactic, which is the live-in flip, which is just what you would think, like a fixer-upper episode or a flip in any other case, except you're living there. So the benefits of this, again, are the same in that you can get loans that maybe are going to be lower down payments. You also are living there, so you're not having to rent something. The downside of this is also pretty apparent. You have to live in a construction zone, and that's not great. That's not fun when you have kids or anything like that. I've never personally done a real heavy live-in flip. We did one where we renovated the house we lived in, like very minorly. It was mostly done, to be honest, and we put some trim and stuff in, and I still didn't like that very much, if I'm being frank. So I may do this in the future, but it's not at the top of my list. But if you're a single person who can relegate yourself to maybe one room at a time, this may be a really good option for you to reduce that initial liability of purchasing the house. So there's two ways you can go about doing getting a construction doing a renovation, live and flip. And the first is going to be a construction loan or a renovation loan in the traditional sense. And this, again, varies by lender. So I'm talking generalities here and what would happen in my market and what happens probably pretty similarly in a lot of markets here in the US. If you want a construction loan, what they'll do is first you buy a house, you get the offer accepted on the thing, you get bids to see how much it's going to cost to fix it up. The bank sends out an appraiser to do what's called a paper appraisal for what the house is going to be worth, the after repair value, ARV, and then you get a loan to value based on that ARV. So let's say when it's all said and fixed, they're estimating it's going to be worth $300,000, just to keep our numbers pretty similar. And they say, okay, we'll give you 80% LTV or loan to value of that, which would be $240,000. And hopefully, if everything went well, you could wrap in your purchase price and the cost to fix it up in that $240,000. If you can't, you got to bring extra cash basically to say, hey, all right, I need 10, 20, 30 more grand on top of that to make this deal work. Then you got to bring cash. The other option that we kind of skimmed over is you could get a loan to buy the house and use your own cash to fix it up. So if you do have a lot of free capital, that could be an option for you. But let's go back to a construction loan here, because I think that's going to be more likely what you want to do to try to keep that down payment as low as possible and get those numbers worked. There is a lot of programs through like FHA, VA, USDA RD, which is a rural development loan that allows for rehabbing. We have one here in Alaska through the Alaska Housing Financing Corporation, which is only going to pertain to people in Alaska. But they're pretty similar setups with these other loan types in other states as well. So again, talk to a lender and see what's available to you. But I want to break down the cost of this AHFC, Alaska Housing Financing Corporation loan, kind of see what it looks like, and then I want to run the numbers as if you were to buy something with it. So just like a traditional construction loan, you got to get an offer accepted on a house you want. You got to get an engineer out there to do a report of all the repairs. Then you take that report to your lender. They tell you, hey, these repairs all need to be done. These particular ones are safety issues, and these particular ones are not safety, but they still need to be done. So you get bids on how much it's going to cost from contractors to do all that. And then the bank will do an appraisal again based on the ARV, the after repair value, and they'll do it for the purchase price right now as the property sits. So you kind of have two, I don't know if it's two separate ones or one, sorry, knocked you there, or just one appraisal that kind of covers both. So what you do off of the first, what you bought it for, as long as it appraises for that amount, you pay 5% down on that, on the purchase price, not how much money they're going to lend you, not on what the house is worth in the future. And then they say, okay, now you pay your 5% down. It's going to cost you, we'll say in this case, $30,000 in repair. We're going to give you $30,000 to do those repairs. And they don't have an LTV per se, except that 5% down on the purchase price. So ostensibly, they could go up pretty darn high, even maybe up to 100% of what the total ARV is to get those repairs fixed in. So this keeps your down payment low and the cash needed pretty low as well, as long as you get a deal that works and the repairs aren't so exorbitant that they outweigh what the house is going to be worth. And then one thing I didn't cover on the construction loan is when you get a construction loan, it's usually a 1-year term, interest only payments, and the interest is pretty high. So at the end of that year, when you finished doing that renovation, you've got to refinance into a longer term loan, which costs extra money. Whereas this particular option, you do, once you close on the house, you have 2 months to repair any safety issues and 6 months to do the rest of the repairs. And then once that's all done, you don't refinance. Like you've spent the money you need to spend to get it done, and you're already in a 30-year loan. So that's pretty great interest rates, comparable to like a conventional loan, which is more like maybe 3 to 4%. These days, maybe that's going up, it sounds like. So that's another thing to think about there. So again, just running the numbers, if we took this house, just kind of give you the overall numbers, you were able to buy it for $240,000 because the condition was so bad and you needed to put $30,000 into it, and we use this AHFC rehab loan. What would it look like after 5 years? Let's find out. So again, most of your monthly expenses would be the same. Your mortgage would only be $823.17. Your down payment would be $12,000 because it's 5% of $240 instead of 3% of $300 or $270 or anything else we've ran. Closing costs again be pretty similar, and it'd put your total monthly expenses at about $2,500, and the first year would be about $30,000, and then we'd stair step it up from there to pay it based on inflation and such. So after 5 years, this house again would cost you about $171,000, which is very similar to buying it cheap, or even pretty similar to just buying it traditionally. So when you do this live and flip, it's not that much cheaper over the 5 years. But again, now you've got appreciation and the amortization to add back in, which takes you down from $171,000 down to $72,000, which is right in the range of if you bought it $30,000 cheaper. And again, it makes sense because really you bought it for $240, you put 30 into it, which takes you to $270, and then the house is again worth $300,000 when you get done with all those repairs. So it's pretty similar. It is a little bit cheaper than buying cheap, and that's just because you've paid a little bit more money down. You paid 5% of $240 instead of 3% of $270. So that's kind of the difference there. Something you can do as well is combine these strategies up. So that's, we've only talked about two that are maybe a little bit gimmies that maybe you've already thought of, but we're going to go into a lot more detail on different strategies. And the more you can do to combine these things, like maybe do renovations based with buying it cheap, too, you would get a better deal, and you get you lower your liability even further, make yourself a little bit more money. So just to give you an idea, the combination of doing a live and flip as well as buying something cheap usually comes down to what's called off-market deals. This is buying a house, again, generally, not always, but usually they're distressed. Somebody's wanting to get rid of them fast. They don't hit the market, so they're not getting market value. So you're buying them cheap, and you're buying them distressed, so you're getting them even cheaper. And so you would do the renovation and then hopefully have some extra there. I hesitate to put this in because getting off-market deals generally means fast cash for a seller, and if you're buying something with a loan, it is not fast cash. So you're needing to get a loan, and the seller may not like that, and maybe you have to do some repairs to get it done and such. So I'll include this just as an example, but the likelihood of you doing it without just using cash all the time is pretty low. And there's like a million people that are looking for these off-market deals because they're cheap and you can make a little money in various ways from them, reselling them or renovating them yourself. But let's assume you came into one off-market deal that needed a ton of renovation. You just added all those things up. So instead of getting that same renovation deal we just talked about for $240, you got it for $210 because it was off market. And again, the repairs were $30,000. You use that same AHFC loan. Everything else is going to be the same, except we're going to reduce everything by $30,000 because you got it $30,000 cheaper. You found it off market, which again does happen. A lot of these things may sound a little bit wild to you, like who's going to sell their house for less? Why don't they just put it on the market and get what they want? And there's a million reasons. I've done them personally where people just want the cash. They don't want to deal with a bunch of buyers coming into their house. They just want to be quick with it and be done. Don't have to ask for repairs or anything like that. So they're willing to take less. And anytime I've ever done it as a real estate agent, I always felt it was my duty to tell them, like, hey, if you put this on the market with me, which I was happy to do, if you put this on the market, and you will have to pay a commission here, but you'll sell it for more than I'm offering you. But this particular way I'm offering you is cash, and it's fast and has all these other benefits. So it definitely does happen, just so you know. But let's say you luck into one of these situations. After 5 years, again, with the down payment being 5% of the $210 instead of $240, again, look at these tables for the numbers because it's pretty in depth. After 5 years, your cost is only $160,000 as opposed to, I think, $171 from just the live and flip by itself, or just buying it cheap would be about $169. So you're far better off. Your appreciation is even higher. It goes from the $86,000 up to $116,000. Because now you bought the house for $210, you put 30 into it, and when you got done with the renovations, it was worth $300,000. So you had instant appreciation or sweat equity of $60,000, and then you had another $56,000 over the 5-year term that it appreciated from there. Your amortization again is a little bit lower. It's only $34,000 because your loan to begin with had less principal, so you just paid less principal down in 5 years. You went to sell it, you paid the same commission, same closing costs as all the other times. except now when all said and done, if you add all those together, you're at $36,000 and some change is what it costs you to live there for 5 years. So the one thing we haven't talked about yet is cash flow. We've been dealing a lot with the appreciation and the amortization. We've been ignoring the tax benefits, although you could be getting some off of those even in these cases we've talked about. But any of these options we've talked about, we have not included any form of cash flow, which is renting it out in some manner. So these flipping options where you're pushing the value up with your sweat equity, with renovating the things, they're actually better served in the short term. So if you were to own something for 2 years, like that same situation we just talked about, instead of selling it over 5 years, you sold it after 2 years, you would actually make about $2,500, a little bit less than $2,500 instead of spending $36,000. Because when you first did the renovation, you got that $60,000 in equity, and you're not living there for 5 years, you're only living there for 2 years. So all your expenses were much lower. Again, if you remove at the end of 2 years, you still have to move somewhere. So if you kept doing these live-in flips, you could make more money that way, to be frank. But those forced appreciation plays are really better if you flip them quick. Now, the only thing you have to think about there is when you sell something in less than 2 years as your primary residence, you're probably going to get hit on the capital gains tax, or if you never live there at all, capital gains for the profits you make. Whereas with your primary residence, if you live there for 2 of the last 5 years, up to a certain amount, depending if you're single or married, capital gains you don't pay taxes on. So, and again, talk to a tax professional. This is not advice. I am not a tax professional. I'm very, very far from it. But anyway, so those kind of forced appreciations are better in the short term. Cash flow is really, really good in the long term, because if you are getting someone to rent something, you may only be getting like $100 in the positive each month or something, or even maybe it shows it's not in the positive, but over the long term, it's squashed a lot of your expenses out. Then that gets better and better. So 5, 10, 15 years, the longer you go, the better it gets, as long as you're making that cash flow. And I find cash flow a lot more interesting because it is kind of a more passive income. You still definitely have to work on rentals. It's not completely passive, whereas doing like a flip is very much a job. So there's 3 different kinds of rentals when we're looking at cash flow. There's long, mid, and short-term rentals. So long-term rentals is just what you probably always think. It's somebody who has maybe a 1-year lease. They're paying every month on an agreed-upon amount that was in that lease. Pretty normal. Short-term rentals are getting way more popular. You're probably thinking of Airbnb, which is like a hotel transaction. Basically, people are there for as little as 1 night and longer, and they're paying per night. And a midterm, a lot of people don't think about these midterm rentals at all, actually. And that is for people staying like month to month or even week to week, and needing a little bit longer than nightly rates, but not as long as like a year-long lease. And this can be, we're in a military area here, so this could be people moving to the area and needing a few months to get closed on a house or to find a rental or something, and needing a few months in a house. Usually you do have to furnish these out, just the same as an Airbnb. A short-term rental, you need to furnish that out as well. It could be traveling nurses, it could be construction workers that are traveling as well, that need to be somewhere for about 3 months. Those are really good scenarios, because a lot of times if it's workers, they're getting per diems, and they're getting paid to pay you for that rental. So they're happy to do it, and you're making money. In a lot of cases, I've got buddies who do it, that they even pocket a little money for themselves because they're not staying in a hotel, which is way more expensive than maybe a midterm rental there. So you can use any 3 of these for all these next tactics are involving rental in some way. I'm going to use a variation. I'll use one of each just as an example, but you may decide that one or the other may be better for you. And generally, this is not always the case. Run the numbers. Generally, the shorter the term, the more profits you can make, but also the more work you have to do. So if you're in a short-term rental, you ostensibly could make the most profit, but you also have the most headache because people are coming in and out. You're having to contact them, tell them how to get into the property. You have to clean the property, every few days or every night in some cases. So you do have a lot more work there. So One other thing is rental income can help you get qualified for a bigger loan, which is really great. So these next ones, we're going to look at trying to get them rented. Let's say you were only approved for $300,000 based on your income, how much money you have, your credit, all of that. The lender says you're good, we'll give you a loan for $300,000. Well, you find yourself maybe a fourplex or something that's more expensive, but it has rental history in it. You can come to the lender and say, hey, listen, buying this property is gonna make me money. So I think we can push that $300,000 up, and that is the case. Again, depending on the depending on the lender and what they're gonna require. Some of them need a lot of history. Some of them we've got into where there was no history, but we got a signed lease from a tenant that's like, yeah, I'm gonna move in. When this closes, I'll move in, and here's a year-long lease or whatever. So you might have to get creative on that, on how you're gonna do it. Just kind of bring your case before the lender, the almighty lenders, and let them decide if we can make it happen. But that is something to think about, that even if you're only qualified to $300,000, maybe you could push it higher. Just keep in mind that your down payment, of course, is gonna go up too, so you will need more cash for that and the closing costs. So the first option we're gonna look at for making this a little bit cheaper is renting out a room. And the subject house we've been talking about is a 3-bedroom. Let's say you are a single person or maybe just a couple, and you're using the 1-bedroom, the master suite, and you're using one for a guest room. You may have an extra bedroom that, hey, you're willing to rent out. And again, this is a bit of a sacrifice because you're going to share your living space with tenants. So again, you can do a long, mid, or short term in this case. Quick note on those, you do want to make sure on your zoning, your covenants, and any other governmental body in the area that they're allowing these kind of rentals. Usually long-term rental is the most used and the most normal, but even then some covenants do restrict. Just looking at a neighborhood that you can rent the property out, but you can't rent the property out while you're living on the property. So for that particular neighborhood, which is only about 10 houses, this article would just be totally useless because they don't want that mixed up for some reason. That's kind of a weird one. So let's say you're going to do a room rental though in this same house, the $300,000 house. Again, all your closing costs and everything is going to be the same, except you do need to furnish that room. So I've added $1,500. That should give you enough for a bed and such, because we want to go a short-term rental. And you're going to need it to be furnished, just for this example here. So for that short-term rental on our area, you could probably get about $60 a night, which is pretty great, to be honest with you, just for a room. And this house in particular was kind of cool, as well set up, because the master suite did have a bathroom, but also one of the other bedrooms had a bathroom that attached to it. So this would be a really good setup. They'd have their own bathroom. You wouldn't have to share. You just clean that sucker, and you can even delegate them. The short-term people say, hey, this is don't use anybody else's bathroom, basically. So $60 a night. We're gonna put an occupancy at about 18 days of the month, which is about 60%, which again, in this area may be a little bit low. A lot of people I've talked to, it's been a lot higher, but we'll be conservative just in case. And then same as a rental, we'll increase that by 5% annually. And that does vary. Here in Alaska, the summer and winters are way different. I would think it kind of evens out. We do have the Northern Lights tourism up here and such during the winter time when it's super cold, but also the summertime, the weather's great. Midnight sun, bunch of fun stuff happening in the summer. A lot of travel, people coming up for that as well. So anyways, $18, we're gonna say average. And then if you decide to clean it, if it's in the same house with you, why the heck not? We're gonna put that at $25 for cleaning, and we'll say 8 nights out of the month that you're gonna clean it, because people aren't gonna just stay one night. They may, but we're just gonna average it for 8 nights. Now, like I've said before, Airbnb is kind of the most popular site for this. They charge 3% fee on both the the nightly rate and the cleaning fee there. So we're gonna deduct that 3% just so we're a little bit more realistic. And like I said, the furnishing, we'll say that you furnished it for $1,500, which for one room, I think that's pretty reasonable to do. But if you feel like you want to go more expensive with that, absolutely do. So your monthly expenses, I did raise a little bit extra. The electric, raised it up $100 a month to $245 to account for the extra person living there, which that's pretty steep, to be honest, but just in case. Another $15 a month for the water and the sewer, and then another $50 a month extra for maintenance, which is kind of where I'm throwing in like cleaning supplies and such, is going to be in there. So it bumps your total monthly expenses up to $28.44 and 28 cents. And as a reminder, we're just buying this traditionally, just as we did in that first example of buying. The only thing is we're going to rent that room out. So your first year total is $34,000 and some change. Everything's going to go up again based on inflation and rental rates rising and such. So your expenses here are at $191,025, which has been the highest so far. So your expenses are definitely higher, obviously based off of increased utilities and the cleaning and such. But now we have some cash flow. So looking down at compared to everything else, we're keeping the appreciation the same at $56,000. We're keeping the amortization the same at $38,000 and some change as that first buy. But the cash flow, this is the first time we're going to look at cash flow here, and it is $82,327.73, and that's over 5 years. That's pretty stinking good. So you've gone just buying it normally from $110,000 and some change, that's what it costs you, all the way down to $39,000 and some change by renting that room out. So that may leave you feeling a little bit sad, because you're like, well, it still cost me 40 grand to live there for 4 years. But really, this is very much a case where a dollar saved is a dollar earned, because you have to live somewhere. So you're at, what is that, $70,000 cheaper over 5 years. It's literally $70,000 that you would have had to spend. So it's money in your pocket. So that's I don't know, that's pretty darn good over 5 years. That's well over 10 grand a year that you're making just off that rental there. So that's a pretty cool option if you're willing to do it. The next would be a house hack, which really a room rental could be considered under a house hack as well. A house hack is basically having some kind of rental and living in one part of the rental of the house. So what we're going to use for this example is a fourplex. And the reason we stopped at 4 is because most of the primary residence loans, like FHA and such, 4 is their max. You can't get 5 units or more than that. So we'll say we went all the way, so deciding to fourplex, you're gonna live in one of the units and rent the other 3 out. We obviously can't use the same subject property because it's just a single family home. Okay, so what that fourplex actually looks like, and again, this is another deal that actually sold in my market within the past few months here. So it sold for $365,000. 2 of the units had 2 bedrooms and rented for $1,100 a month, and the other 2 units had 3 bedrooms and rented for $1,250. The documents on this one were a little slim, like on utilities and such, so I did have to take some liberty in kind of guessing what those would be for our area. Again, it's hard to go back and dig these numbers up. They've already sold. I'm not actually going to be purchasing it. So whereas you're actually going to purchase something, getting these numbers is a lot easier to do. But we are going to raise the rates up once again, because I think the rents were a little low. The 2 bedrooms will be about $1,200, and the 3 bedrooms will put at $1,350. So this being a primary residence, we're going to move you into a 2 bedroom to limit the amount of money that is not being brought in from a rental. So you're going to have 2 of the 3 bedrooms at $1,350 and 1 at $1,200 a month. Again, to increase 5% annually, just as the other rentals have. So if we look at the expense side, we're going to use an FHA loan for this one, the example, which is 3.5% down. Your down payment would be $12,775. Put the closing costs at about $10,000. Again, kind of average for this area. Now the rest of these are going to be pretty different because the subject property is different. So I do want to go over the year 1 expenses. And again, remember, inflation is going to take up all the utility expenses as well by 1.8%. So your mortgage would be $23.81 and 43 cents. Your electric is only about $60, which is great for that particular unit. The water and sewer, you're paying that for everybody, so that's about $350 a month. The fuel, you're paying for everybody, so that's about $800 a month. The maintenance on it, we put up to $300, and then that adds for your first year. Total monthly would be about $38.91 and 43 cents. So your first year altogether total would be $46,697.16. Those numbers would increase up little by little each year, and adding it all together, including the down payment and closing costs, would be about $259,548. Whew. So much more expensive as far as just the expenses go than anything else we've looked at. The most expensive before this was really the room rental, because you had the extra upfront costs and such. But this one is more by about $70,000 even than that. However, the cash flow is going to be way better. Just a little teaser there. So we did the appreciation on it 3.5% as well. The purchase price was a little bit higher, so the appreciation went up by about $68,000 and some change. The loan pay down, the amortization, that gave you a benefit of about $49,000. The cash flow, here's the big one, that gave you $232,000 over 5 years. And that is, just so you guys know, that's with a 90% vacancy there. So we figured a 60% occupancy. We figured a 60% occupancy on the Airbnb. Long-term rentals don't have nearly as much turnover. I think 90% occupancy is actually maybe even low for this area. People are just clamoring to get in to rentals, long-term rentals especially. But anyway, just to be safe, that is with, 1 out of every 10 months we're considering vacant over the 5-year period. So that's, I think, pretty reasonable. Again, that puts that cash flow at $232,000. You sell it. We're assuming that you sold the darn thing. The commission did go up to about $26,000 because that purchase price was higher, and then we put the closing costs at $7,500 instead of $5,000 that we've done for that single family house. And this puts you in the positive, boys and girls. That feels pretty good. So the liability of just buying it traditionally, or heck, even just renting it, we went from renting it was $159,000, buying it traditionally was $110,000. Now we're in the positive by $57,000. So that is a $167,000 difference from just buying it traditionally, which is about $33,000 a year that you're making, which is that's a pretty good starter income of somebody. It's like having one of your kids get a job that, what is that, like 20 bucks an hour or so? 20 bucks an hour, 18 bucks an hour, and just giving you all the money and not costing you any more. So that's pretty darn good. All right, and the last on the list is going to be the accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU. And again, this is pretty similar to a house hack. It probably could be classified under a house hack, but I do want to separate it out because there are a few differences. Again, make sure that these will work with your local zoning, covenants, governmental bodies, all that jazz. It's generally it's a separate living space in a single family residence property. So this could be a mother-in-law suite attached to the house with its own entrance. This could be, something you converted to have another living space in the house. It could be an over the garage situation. It could be a little cabin that is on the property as well, that you could rent out. And again, basically it feels pretty similar to a duplex, but it's not as clean cut as, like what you would expect a duplex to look at, because it's sitting on a single family lot. So when you do an ADU, these ones are kind of tough to find a real number for, because a lot of these are not being turned in. This is not happening too often in this area, where they're just renting out a little piece and you don't know what they're going to do when they buy it. So what I've done for this one, just for the number's sake, is adding $75,000 to the $300,000 house that we've been using, that single family, and just saying that there was a little attached mother-in-law suite, or whatever you want to call it, a cabin or whatever. So it did cost $75,000 more to get it, but we've got another little cabin that we're going to use for a midterm. So we've done a long-term example, and we've done a short-term rental example. So let's go for midterm here and assume that you've got a construction worker or whatever who's going to be paying weekly for this, and you'd be looking at about $350 a week. I put the occupancy rate between the long-term rental and the short-term at 80%. So you are going to have more turnaround and some empty times there. But yeah, pretty darn good. And then we'll increase these rates at 5% annually, and you got to furnish the thing. So we're going to say it's bigger than just a room, so we'll give $6,500 to furnish it. You need TV, couch, all that kind of stuff to go in there in this particular case. So that can add up. Your down payment's going to go up as well, $11,250, because it's now $375,000 for the house instead of $300,000. Closing costs went up as well, $10,000. So your mortgage, electric, all that we'll kind of go through. Mortgage would be about $2,441, electric would be $215, because you will have somebody else living with you. You could meter that thing separately, to be honest, but we just kind of added it in for this one. Water and sewer, $105, fuel, $250, maintenance, $250 a month as well. So your monthly expenses would be $3,261, and your yearly total would be about $39,134. Again, everything to increase with, not everything, but all your utilities to increase up by 1.8% for inflation. And after 5 years, that would give you a total of $225,224.52. So compared to anything else, again, still pretty darn expensive. It's almost as expensive as the fourplex that you bought. The purchase price was higher, the $375 than the $365 for the fourplex. So I'm not saying this is the best option, but just to give an idea of what this would look like with the real numbers. So again, your appreciation would be a little bit higher because we did start at $375, and a 3.5% increase would give you $70,000 over 5 years. Your amortization would be pretty good as well at $48,000, and your cash flow is still pretty good too. Not as good as a fourplex, but $80,000, and that was very similar to the room rental, to be honest. So I don't know. Again, this may not be the best option there, depending on the rates in your area. It's kind of interesting. So commission is going to be a little bit higher at $26,000, and we'll put the closing cost at $8,000 to sell the thing. So you've still had to pay for 5 years $60,000 to live there. And again, the room rental took you down about 20 grand less. So it was, I would say, I'd go for that room rental option if these numbers were to hold true. But yeah, still interesting, still way cheaper than, again, it's not somebody living with your living space, so it may be worth it for you to make a little less money and have your own separate living space. But again, in those situations, again, I'd probably just go for the old house hack with the fourplex, personally. So what do we do now with this? We've kind of gone through a lot of tactics you can use to make some money from your primary residence and reduce that liability. And at least with the house hack, we did turn that into an asset. And this was based off of a house that really, I didn't run through a bunch of numbers to try and find the best house. I just kind of found one that had most of the documents with it. That would be the easiest to kind of show, like, hey, here's what the utilities and stuff cost. So to make it as realistic as possible. And it was still pretty eye-opening. So I don't think I would personally use at least the single family for any of these options. I think there's probably better options in our market in particular. The house hack was pretty good, to be honest. I'd take another one of those, the fourplex there. But what should you do in your market? Number one, I think you should run the numbers on what it's costing you to live where you're living right now. And then you can kind of decide if one of these excited you, like maybe doing the house hack or doing a room rental. Maybe you're in a position already where you could do a room rental. Again, just run the numbers and see what it looks like and see if it's going to be worth it for you, or if you need to move or change your living situation to make things better for you. So all these numbers that I ran are probably they're absolutely useless to you because they're for a house that is already sold. And so unless you were in the market a few months ago when that sold and you bought that house, these numbers aren't realistic for you because it's not your situation. But again, my bigger point was to teach you how to do these calculations and then kind of see what these tactics look like in real life. Again, in the number sense. So hopefully it did both those things for you. But if you want to do your own numbers, the 4 easy steps that we've gone over a few times with these is add up your expenses for each month and all your one-time costs, such as down payments and such. Decide how long you intend to live in the house. So if you want to live there for 5-10 years and that's your goal, you need to set your goal, but just be as realistic as possible on this one. So set that term. And then if you're calculating for a purchase, add up all the money-making benefits. If you're calculating for a rental, of course, you don't really have any money-making benefits except maybe getting your deposit back. And then subtract the money makers from your total expenses over that term, if it's 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, whatever, and see where you land. So again, be as realistic as possible on these. Don't try to make the numbers look better for rentals. Don't try to make them look better for a house hack. Just try to be as realistic as possible, and then let the numbers speak for themselves. You're always going to risk something. Even if you decide to stay where you're at, you've made a decision to do that because it is costing you something. So not making a decision is making the decision in this case. And I think it's really important that you know the decision you're making, even if you know it's not the biggest moneymaker. Because here's the other big deal, is that where you live is more than just a financial consideration. It's your life, So I've had people overpay for houses and such, and them being aware of it, and I don't think they're stupid for doing it either. As a real estate agent, I think, listen, you're living there and you want to be happy, and if you have the extra money to spend, a lot of people waste money on way stupider things. I think a home is really important, and so if you're not willing to do some of these things because it would make you so uncomfortable you wouldn't be happy, then don't do them. I'm not going to do them all. I'm not going to probably do a live and flip. I already talked about that. I'm not going to rent a room out. I've got 3 kids and a wife, and I wouldn't feel comfortable with it at this stage. So I've got to look for, my main interest is really an ADU and a house hack. That's what I'm looking for personally next. So do the same for yourself. See where you'd be comfortable, and don't be afraid to push yourself a little bit if you need to. So if you've been too afraid to do these things in the past, pick the one that sounds the easiest to you, even if it is a little bit scary. So you do need to push a little bit, but at the end of the day, you got to live your life and be happy. So, and another last quick disclaimer is I'm not a financial, tax, or legal advisor. So if anything sounded like advice, it was not. It's just me talking about stuff and just purely for information for you guys. So hopefully it was really helpful. And yeah, check out the article if you want to see all the real numbers.